about being human. What does it mean to be human, and how is your perception of what it means to be human actually, in large part, an act of faith of one type or another? People have faith in all sorts of things. I suspect that when you went to bed last night, you anticipated, you had faith that this morning, when you woke up, that the entire socio-economic system would still be here. If you've been reading your newspapers lately, you might have had some question about that. But, that's an act of faith, right? You have faith in all sorts of things. So that's what I'd like to look about and talk about, this idea about being human and what faith has to do with that. So I read just a little while ago this. Once it was a simple enough matter to be a human being, but now it's deeply difficult because life was once simple, but is now complex, confused, multifarious. That was written by Woodrow Wilson in 1897. It sounds like it was written yesterday, but actually, truth be told, I think most people, at whatever point in history they were alive, thought that being human was complicated and difficult. And certainly Woodrow Wilson, who is perhaps certainly one of the most academically qualified presidents we've ever had, he thought it was difficult and complicated to be a human being in the world when he was alive. It's hard. And so when we talk about being human, you might say, well, I don't really care about talking about being human. And when I see one, I know one. If I see a being, I can say, oh, that being is a human, but that being is a dog or a butterfly, whatever. You might say, I know one when I see one. Yeah, put it to you, maybe it's not quite that simple. In modern day culture, there's a very well-known book by Erich Fromm called On Being Human that asks all sorts of questions about what is it you recognize as a human quality. C.S. Lewis has a famous poem called On Being Human. And then on modern day movies and TV series, there are all sorts of them that explore the question of what does it mean to be human. Like, for example, the one I show at the bottom there called, the TV show series is called Being Human. And there are three main characters, as you can see. And they live in a house together, and they interact with the people around them. And if you look at them, you'd say, oh, I recognize those beings are human. Except they're not in the TV series. One of them is a ghost, one of them is a vampire, and one's a werewolf. And then in the picture on the right, there's all sorts of bits and pieces of movies and TV series there. The one at the top with the striking-looking lady with blonde hair and a red dress, two people standing next to her. You all recognize that, right? That's. I know Abe does. He's like shrugging. I know this. This is from Battlestar Galactica, one of the best science fiction TV series ever made, in my opinion. And you might look at all three of those characters and say, well, they're all obviously human. Except they're not. The lady in the red dress with the blonde hair is a sort of a biological product. She's really a robot, an entirely organic one. They're called Cylons in this series. She is a Cylon. She's not a human being. She knows that she's a Cylon, and she's acting out on behalf of her people during the series. The person on the far right is somebody who grew up believing that she was a human being and was at war with the Cylons, and only later discovers she's not human at all. She's really a Cylon who had been implanted into the human community. And the guy in the middle is, as far as I can tell, a regular human being. The point of the series is you can't tell by looking. So what is it that makes one of them human and the other one not? Assuming that you don't really care about how they were constructed. Are there qualities that you say, this is a human being, oh, that's a robot, or that's definitely not a human being? How do you do that? What's that all about? So one thing you could do, of course, is you could go and ask people about what does it mean to be human. You could go ask a philosopher like, so that's a bust of Aristotle. You could go ask a scientist, so the lady in the middle, that's Barbara McClintock, very famous scientist, or a theologian like Sarah Coakley, and say to them, tell me, what do you think it means to be human? If you go ask philosophers, of course it depends which philosopher you ask, what answer you will get. I chose Aristotle because in my opinion, understanding a little bit about Aristotle is really important in Christianity. So Aristotle was the personal tutor of, do we remember? Alexander the Great. Thank you, Nathan. Yes, so can you imagine that? If you're Alexander the Great was a little boy growing up, and right up until he was in his late teens, Aristotle was his personal tutor. He came to his house and taught him. I mean, how cool is that, to have Aristotle as your personal tutor? And then Alexander the Great swept across most of the known world, taking with him Greco-Roman philosophy and culture and so on that he had learned from Aristotle. So, and he died very young, probably poisoned, but all of that happened in the period in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so that's why when you get to the Old Testament and you turn the page in your Bible, you get to the New Testament, suddenly it's in a different language, going in a different direction on the page. And what happened as you turned the page was Alexander the Great, who was taught by Aristotle. So if you know something about Aristotle, it really helps see what happened. I'll show you in a minute. So we could ask Aristotle here. Now, Aristotle, if you were to ask Aristotle, what does it mean to be human, which is a question he was very much interested in, he would start off by telling you that what causes something to be something, what causes, say, a being to be human, you can break down into 4 different areas. He saw causation as having 4 components. Now, almost nobody today does this. In particular, scientists today do not see 4 different types of causation. He believed that purpose was causal. So what that means is, there's this very famous example that's in nearly all the textbooks about philosophy. If you went up to Aristotle and you said, what causes it to rain? Now, we all know the answer to this, right? Because in junior high, pretty much everybody had to do one of those projects where you make a poster and put it on the wall, and it shows water coming up from the lake and evaporating, and it cools and forms clouds, and they blow around, and then temperature changes, rain falls, hits the floor, goes back to the lake, right? The water cycle. And you say, this is why it rains. And Aristotle would have looked at you and said, no. That's how it rains. I don't care about how it rains. I didn't ask you that. And anyway, I knew all of that because he did. He was, I want to know why it rains. And his answer to why does it rain is to make the grass grow. That's the purpose of rain, to make plants and things grow. So purpose is causal in his mind. Now that sounds very weird. If you actually wanted to explore that, I'd be happy to sit down with you for half an hour and explain to you these 4 modes of causation and why purpose is causal, because I think it's very important and it's an idea we have abandoned. So he would say, to identify what a human being is, first of all, you have to know what the purpose of a human being is, and then whether that purpose is being fulfilled, because it's the purpose that causes the being to be human. So the way he looked at it was a human's purpose is about the exercise of virtue in accord with reason to bring about what he called happiness. Now, happiness to Aristotle was not like skipping about, smiling with balloons and things. Happiness was really about the exercise of virtue. He said that's what happiness really means. If you don't exercise virtue, you will never be happy. To Aristotle, being human is about being suited to one's purpose. It means doing what you were meant to do as a human being. And that's the only place in which you can find happiness and meaning, says Aristotle. The problem with Aristotle, though, is he took kind of a narrow view of groups of people and what their purpose might be. For example, in his writing Politics, he refers to what he calls a natural slave. And a natural slave is anyone who, while being human, is by nature not his own, but is of someone else, is owned by someone else. And so what that means is that that person is a piece of property and is a tool. We've talked about the idea of slaves as tools before. So he would say if you were born a slave, what you should do is work towards being the best possible slave you can be. And if you were born a slave owner, you should work towards being the best possible slave owner that you can be. You see, he thought each little category of person had a specific purpose. You might say, what are you talking? Well, if you don't know that, and then you come across the Apostle Paul saying to you, there is neither slave nor free, nor male nor female, nor Jew nor Greek, you won't understand what Paul is talking about. What Paul is talking about is it's not right to divide people up into categories with different purposes. Everybody has the same category. They are all one in Christ Jesus. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about this. So that's very important, I think. We could, of course, ask a scientist, what is it that makes you human? And you may have heard people say things like, you are the sum of your genes, that type of thing. I don't like that idea at all. First of all, if you're really the sum of your genes, and your genes are really a way of programming information, it means that you're programmed to be who you are. And so the whole question of things like free will and stuff becomes very difficult to deal with if you believe that you are simply the sum of your genes. I happen to believe that you are the sum of your genes, but you're actually much more than that. The other problem with this is if we say, well, we know a human being when we see one, so if I see you and I say, oh, you're a human being, but then I realize if what I'm really mean by human being is something that is being controlled and generated by genes, then the important thing to realize would be that the total of the genes in your body, you have about 3 times as many bacterial genes in your body as you do human genes. I mean, that's just extraordinary, right? So there are far more bacterial genes in your body than human genes. What you are, as to a geneticist, is simply a big container of bacteria that's walking around. And the purpose, if you were to do it statistically, the purpose is on protecting the bacteria. So that's strange, isn't it? So that idea that you're simply a product of your genes is weird, because your genes are mostly bacterial genes. You have huge hosts of bacteria in your gut and things, right? So, and in fact, even in the human genome, if you were to look in the human genome, there is right now, we know of about 150 genes in the human genome that are not of human origin. They're mostly of bacterial origin, which means that you're not just carrying the bacteria around, they're infiltrating your genome. They're taking over. This is just the way it is. So to say, well, you're the sum of your genes is extremely misleading and will take you to some really funny places in your thinking. Genes are obviously important. I'm not saying that they're not, but surely you must be more than that. So then we could go ask a theologian, and there are lots of different types of theologians, but I thought we might pick, say, that area in which the Old Testament and the New Testament and systematics overlap with each other, and people usually call that biblical theology. That's right, in the middle there. So what could we learn about being human there? Well, last week was Trinity Sunday, and we talked about the doctrine of the Trinity. So if you were here, you might remember I said there's 2 if statements followed by a then statement. If it's true that we are made in the image of God, and if the best description of God that we have is Trinity, then it follows that this series of propositions is true. That's what we talked about last week. So if we're made in the image of God, if the Trinity is a reasonable description of God, then we are made to be one people because there's one God. We are made to be together because the Trinity is a little community. We are made for diversity in community because the three persons of the Trinity are all different from each other. We are made for equality because there is no hierarchy within the Trinity in the classical sense. We're made to be unique because each person of the Trinity is unique in comparison with the others, and we are made to stick together because the Trinity represents one God that you cannot break apart. It's impossible. So all of that, you see, is at the intersection. That's a sort of biblical theology here. What I thought it would be good to do, though, is to focus more centrally on this question about being a human being. So if you go look in the Old Testament, if you were to get out your New Revised Standard Version of the Bible and go look in the book of Daniel in the 7th chapter, which is in the Aramaic section of Daniel, you would see the New Revised Standard Version tells you that Daniel, who is speaking here, he says, as I watched in the night visions, which is kind of code for as I had a dream while I was asleep, I saw one like a human being coming with the cloud of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him, and so on and so forth. So you think, oh, look, there's something about human beings here. If we're trying to figure out what is a human being, that's nice. But this is another one of those places where the people who translated the text from Aramaic into English were trying to be very helpful to you, and so they took a technical term and explained it in their translation. If you were to go back and look at, say, the King James Version of the Bible, where they don't do that, what it says in the King James Version is, there's the dream, and behold, one like the Son of Man came. Now, the previous version said one like a human being, and now it says one like the Son of Man, and the other translation said came to the Ancient One, and here it says the Ancient of Days. The important point being that the Son of Man and human being are two different ways of translating the same Aramaic expression. If you want to know what it is to be a human being, then what you really want to know is what does it mean to be Son of Man? Because it's the same thing, it's the same term. In Aramaic, that's it, and the little thing on the right, the bar enosh in Daniel 7, by the time you get to the New Testament, because I said we'd look where these things overlap with each other, we're now writing in Greek, and we know why we're writing in Greek, don't we? Because of Alexander the Great, the guy that we talked about. He brought that language with him as he swept across the Mediterranean basin. You see the expression Son of Man that I highlighted there in Greek. So, what does that mean? It means that the Son of Man is a kind of archetype of a human being. Some of the more recent Bible translations translate the same Aramaic expression as the fully human one, or the perfect human being, things like that. So, Son of Man is a technical term that means fully human person. And when you read your New Testament, you discover that out of all of the ways that Jesus can be referred to, lots of people called him Son of David, Son of God, Rabbi, Prophet, things like that. When Jesus referred to himself, what does he call himself? Son of Man. That's Jesus' own term for himself, with his own understanding that the technical term Son of Man means fully human one. If you want to be fully human, there is an example that you can look at. And that example is Jesus. So now we know a lot of the things that Jesus did, with the idea that the Son of Man is an archetype for a human being. It's what it means to be human. So you could say, well, what things did Jesus do? Those are things that we would expect a human person to do. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, although he didn't really do a lot of that. Work with lepers, the blind, the people who couldn't walk, that sort of thing, right? These are ways in which an individual reaches beyond themselves. This is a sort of example of transcendent behavior. You move beyond yourself. But the ultimate example of what Jesus does, of course, comes in his death and resurrection, right? It's sort of the pinnacle of the story here. So I would say that if Jesus is the archetype for being fully human, as the Son of Man, one of the things that he embodies and incorporates is the idea that there are some things that are more important than simply staying alive. I don't think there's any other species that thinks something like that. I think maybe only human beings can even do it. To think so far beyond yourself that you can see an idea, and that idea is more important to you than you staying alive. Now, when people do that, they think that far beyond themselves to an idea that's that important. That's how you change the world. Jesus did it. Mohandas Gandhi did it. Martin Luther King Jr. did it. Those were people who knew that the trajectory that they were on was going to put their own life at huge risk. Gandhi through starvation, and Martin Luther King Jr. through brutality from other people. They knew that that was a likely encounter on the path, and it didn't stop them because the idea that they had was more important to them than simply staying alive. It's the ultimate way of transcending the self. And so I would say to you that that's an important idea, and that while the philosophers can help us think about what it means to be human, and the scientists can help us, the theologians have a voice in this, and the voice is an important one. Now, where we choose to place our faith, whether you place your faith in a certain philosophical model or a scientific one or a theological one or a socioeconomic one, I think we actually flip about between these all the time, which is why I said that faith is on shifting sand. For example, in philosophical method can be really helpful in clearing up muddy thinking. I have a friend who's a philosopher, and when people say to him, "What do you do for a living?" he says, "I help people clear up muddy thinking." He helps people think through things. So, you have a choice. You're going to take the red pill or the blue pill. That's a reference to the movie The Matrix. If you haven't watched that, you should go home immediately and watch it. So, how do you make choices? That sort of thing. Very important. And you can put your faith in some philosophical methods to help you with that. Or with science. Say if you have a little child and the child is sick, my suggestion to you is take them to the doctor and have some faith that the doctor will do their best to use the learnings of science to help that child, right? That's an act of faith. You don't know what the outcome is going to be, but you go to the doctor anyway because you have faith that there's a high probability that something good can come out of it. And then when it comes to theology, Aristotle, I think, was right in terms of thinking about purpose, but wrong in the way he limited it to the place in which you were born or the status in which you were born. And Paul was right when Paul said there's neither slave nor free, male nor female, Greek nor Jew. Everybody is one. They have the same purpose. And that purpose, of course, is about bringing about the kingdom of God. And when we talk about this, and we're talking about faith, remember in the little passage I read you, faith is one of the three theological virtues. When you talk about virtue, and you remember Aristotle talked about virtue is how you attain happiness through virtue and reason. The theological virtues are faith, hope, and love, and they're called theological virtues because you have faith in God. Hope comes from God, and love is something that flows through you from God. And then there are the other four, because there are 7 virtues. The other 4, prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, are called cardinal virtues. And it's not to do with the little red bird. It's because the word is, the Latin word is for a hinge, like you put a door on. That's where you get cardinal from. And so these are virtues that allow you to swing open a door that you can walk through. That's why they're called cardinal here. So those are important, and we've looked a little bit at faith. So faith is a word, dates to about 1200. Comes from the Latin here to do with trust. And in the New Testament, the word faith comes from this verb that really is about trusting. Faith is and trust are so closely linked to each other, you cannot take them apart. It's to trust, to have confidence, and so on and so forth. So when people talk about faith, we're really talking about trust. And I think that's important because lots of people would like it to be that to be a person of faith, I just give you a list of things and say, believe these. But that's not how trust works, right? When I get to know you and you get to know me and I decide I'm going to trust you, that doesn't mean that I know a whole series of propositions about you at all, that I've checked them all off the list. Not at all. It means that through my experience with you, I've come to a position of trust. And that's what faith is there. So, one of my favorite sayings about faith is sort of the opposite. It's from Mark Twain, who of course is a funny guy. Mark Twain, writing, puts these words on the lips of his character, Pudd'nhead Wilson. You don't know Pudd'nhead Wilson, who is a lawyer, by the way, famously says in Mark Twain's book, "Faith is believing what you know ain't so." And of course, lots of people today think this about religious faith. They think there's something wrong with those people. They believe a lot of stuff that we know is not true. That's simply incorrect. And the reason that the little phrase, faith is believing what you know ain't so, is so interesting is because it assumes that you know what believing is. Faith is believing what you know ain't so. What's believing? What's belief? So is it something you know 100% completely with certainty? Is it something in which you trust? So you certainly don't know it 100%, but you trust it here. Is belief something you enact, that you kind of live out? Or is it something that comes from somewhere else, let's say God, and that you reflect like a mirror into the world? Is it something that you engage in? In other words, it's something you do. Is it something you can practice and get better at, like playing a piano? Or is it even something? Is it a thing? Probably not, right? So all of those are questions about faith is believing, and then what you know ain't so. So how do you know things? How do you know? Here, do you have to be 100% certain about something to say you know it? Can God be known or not? And is knowing required for faith? And does knowing come from doing, or does doing come from knowing? Those two questions, that might sound like me being silly. Does knowing stem from doing, and does doing stem from knowing? But I would put it to you that if you read through your Bible very carefully, you would discover that the people of ancient Israel really believed that knowing stems from doing, and that the Greeks, by the time you get to the end of the New Testament, believed that doing stems from knowing. It's the other way around. And that transition occurs largely due to Alexander the Great and Aristotle. So, is knowing something you can practice? Can you get better at knowing things? Or is it simply something you experience, that it comes from somewhere else and you're like the recipient of it? All of those are questions you would have to, I think, really think about if you're going to adopt a statement like Pudd'nhead Wilson's here. And unfortunately, what happens in the world today is people adopt Pudd'nhead Wilson's statements without thinking through what they're actually saying. So I ask as a question, is all of that sort of stuff just a post-Enlightenment Western trap when it comes to thinking about faith? I think it is, and I think that it leads to an incredible arrogance on behalf of people. They say, I know, I am sure, I believe this. And that means if you believe something else, you are wrong, because they know it and they're 100% sure of it about things that you cannot be 100% sure. And that's a big problem, I think. In fact, in the life of the church, if you think about what happens in churches, especially church services, they are largely about the idea of encounter and enactment. You come to church, now hopefully you have some sort of encounter here that's transcendent, that lies beyond yourself. And then we enact a lot of stuff. Like when we do Holy Communion, we're like acting something out. It's like a little stage performance that we do together, right? You become an actor in this little performance here. So worship and ritual are about encounter and enactment, which have got very little to do with knowing and being certain about things. Like if you tell me you're certain about what's going on during Holy Communion, I'm going to be stunned, because I'm not, and nor is anybody else that I've ever met. So there's that. And the warning against arrogance, that type of arrogance we find in the passage that I read, for now we see in a mirror dimly. But then, in the fullness of time, looking back from the end of history, we'll see face to face. And now we only know in part, But then, at the end of history, looking back, we will know fully, even as we are fully known. So this idea of the intersection between the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, and systematics leads us to a position of humility, which of course is important. So I think if we are worrying about what does it mean to be human, that the idea that we have a faith in a certain understanding of encounter and enactment, that we know that we have one who is the archetype of the human person, the Son of Man, the fully human one, who is Jesus Christ. And we're called to follow him along the way. That is what, in Christian dialogue, we're talking about when we say human being. That. So, who should we ask? Should we ask the philosophers and the scientists and the theologians, the authors, the poets, the movie makers, the TV makers? I think we should ask all of them, because they all have important things to say about the question of being human. In the end, it all comes down to this idea, the couple of if statements I made. We read in Genesis that God created humankind in God's own image. So if that's correct, it has consequences. And the consequences for us require us to think seriously about what is God's own image. And we know that God's own image, made flesh in the world, is in the person of Jesus. And so when we look to Jesus, it leads us towards the image of God, what it means to be fully human. So all of that's important. I think one way or another, it's all about faith. The book of Daniel, I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven. I saw one like the Son of Man. This happened in a dream. This wasn't a series of logical propositions that was put to Daniel. He dreamt it. He experienced it. He encountered it. And then he enacted it in his life. And it changed a lot of things for him. When we get it right, this idea of being human, then I think some of the poetic images that the psalmist uses for what the world could be like start to make sense. If we got this idea of being human right, then with the psalmist we could say that in the world in which we live, steadfast love and faithfulness will meet. Righteousness and peace will kiss each other. Faithfulness will spring up from the ground, and righteousness will look down from the sky. That's why it matters. If we want to be human as individuals, we have to be human as a community. And if we're human as a community, then we can be a community of steadfast love and faithfulness. And wouldn't you love to live in a world in which righteousness and peace kiss each other? Because I would.